Friends and attendees, those of you joining us slowly, I've been given a prompt to wait a few minutes until more people slowly file in. So if we can all be more patient than my 4-year-old and slowly people filing in, and we'll kick off, say, in about 2 or 3 minutes. Other than that, I'll go on mute for now, and then I'll come back and I'll introduce our wonderful panelists. Thank you.
For dancing in the alleys and the streets, for the thrill and the fear of getting caught kissing, for my sister, my brother, and unity, for all the times we tried to change their minds and stale beliefs, for the loss of pride, for poverty, for the dream of just a normal life for you and me, for all the children who are starving for a loaf of bread, for the greed of politics and all the lies they spread, for all the mass polluted air we breathe, for all the litter in the streets and all the dying trees, for all the animals who suffer from elimination, for all the cats and dogs who love us without no conditions, for all the tears that seem to never end, for all the images that keep on turning in our heads, for a simple smile to last a little while, for the future generations fighting for their time, for empty promises of heaven in the afterlife, for all the imprisonment of beautiful minds, for all the babies who were born and for the ones who died, for all the times you told the truth and all the times you lied, for all the speeches that we heard about a million times, for all the shacks and shelters that were sold to make a dime, for just a glimpse of a peaceful life, for the rising of the sun after an endless night, for all the pills we pop just to get some sleep, for all mankind and our country, for all the boys and girls who never knew equality, for woman, for life, liberty.
Welcome. Welcome all of you, and thank you for joining us on this important online session, focusing on what's been termed as Australia and New Zealand's response to the Women, Life, Freedom Revolution in Iran. These sessions organised by AUSIRAN from obviously Australia and our friends in New Zealand, the Iranian Solidarity Group in New Zealand. Now, this is part of an ongoing set of sessions, if I can call them briefly, which targets the continued and meaningful interaction with the Iranian community in both Australia and New Zealand. And it allows diverse views, diverse but united views, I should say, when it comes to the topic of women life revolution and what each government in both Australia and New Zealand has done, is doing, and hopefully proposes to do. Can I welcome each and every one of the star-studded and distinguished lineup, this important roundtable. I don't think Our panelists need my introduction, but I've had the good pleasure and fortune of having hosted panels with both of them previously. Senator Claire Chandler is known to all of us here in Australia, and we welcome her again. And I'll formally introduce both of them in more detail in a minute. And also Golriz Ghahraman, a Member of Parliament in New Zealand, also a very dear friend and activist. So welcome to both of you, and thank you for coming. We also have the pleasure of having Hannah Habibi, who will give a short presentation, I think 3 to 5 minutes, on the overview of the key role of women in this uprising in Iran. But a short note about myself, for those of you that don't know me. My name is Faraz Maghami, or with a more English accented, Faraz Magami. I'm a barrister based in Sydney, Australia, but I have an international practice, so I'm between Australia and Europe mainly. And I'm also a member of the National Assembly of Iranian Jurists. You may have heard the term NAIJ, or in Farsi, Shuraya Milliya Huquq-Danan. So the NAIJ is a core group of Iranian jurists internationally with expertise in comparative law, policy, transnational justice, Iranian law, human rights, and more broadly, international law. We are not for profit, we are non-partisan, and we take no sides. So whilst I'm not a member of either AUSIRAN or Iranian Solidarity Group in New Zealand, I am the host in a very neutral way to have the discussion with each and every topic and each and every panelist. Now, can I take another moment and formally introduce our panelists? Firstly, Senator Claire Chandler. Claire is a Liberal Senator for Tasmania here in Australia for our Kiwi friends. She was elected in July 2019. She served as the Deputy Government Whip in the Senate and also the Chair of the Finance and the Public Administration Legislation Committee. She's from Tasmania and she's been there all her life and received her degree in arts and law from the University of Tasmania and worked in Hobart prior to making her entry into Parliament. In the 47th Parliament, Senator Chandler was appointed to the Shadow Ministry and currently serves as the Shadow Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs. She also chairs the Senate Foreign Affairs Defense Trade References Committee, a bit of a mouthful, but it's a very important committee, and it's the committee that held the recent, about a year ago, inquiry into Iran and whose report was published about 6 or 7 months ago. Now, at the time of her election, Claire was the youngest member of the Morrison government. She's also the Australia's youngest currently serving female senator, if I'm not mistaken. And finally, can I say this, that Claire has championed the rights of women and girls in Iran and elsewhere. And as I've noted, she chaired the very important Senate inquiry into the human rights abuses in Iran following the death of Mahsa Jina Amini. She continues to be a very good friend of the Australian Iranian community and generally the people of Iran. And as I've already said in previous sessions, she's a superstar. And no matter which angle you consider her accomplishments, she's done well and she continues to do so. Golriz Ghahraman, our dear friend from New Zealand. Golriz is an Iranian Kiwi refugee and made history as the first ever refugee to be sworn in as an MP in New Zealand. She arrived as a child asylum seeker with her family from Iran, studied at Oxford, and had a career as a lawyer in New Zealand and overseas, having focused on enforcing human rights and holding governments to account, something that she continues to do currently with her role in the Parliament. Her work has included and did include restoring communities after war and human rights atrocities, particularly empowering women engaged in peace and justice initiatives. In New Zealand, she has successfully advocated on human rights issues before the Supreme Court, and before entering Parliament, Golriz was active in the NGO community as reflected by her broad governance roles. Nonetheless, she's our second superstar tonight, and can I welcome both of you to the session this evening. Before we move on, I'm going to ask in a moment Hannah Habibi to um, present to all of us and all the listeners and all the attendees a short session of about 3 or 5 minutes on the key role of women in the uprising that we are seeing in Iran. And whilst we don't need a reminder of what's happened in Iran, I'm just going to say a short paragraph and remind everybody that it's been almost a year and 3 months since the murder of Mahsa Jina Amini at the hands of Iran's so-called morality police. And I think there is no doubt about the facts anymore, even though there were a lot of toing and froing initially. Iranians in the diaspora all around the world, and I have dealt with them in Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Europe, Canada, and elsewhere. They have all come together and been urging the governments to diplomatically pressure Iran by, for example, expelling its ambassadors, designating the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC or Sepah, as we say in Farsi, as a terrorist organization, which is what they are, and to oppose Iran's selection to various UN committees and or expulsion if they're already members. So in this roundtable, as I've already noted, we'll talk about the response of the governments of Australia and New Zealand. But before we do so, can I ask Hannah John to give us her presentation kindly?
Hello, everyone. A warm thank you to Senator Claire and our dear Golriz for joining us tonight, and to all the attendees. Faraz Jan, there is a little bit of a change of topic of what I'm going to talk about. Of course, there is no question about the pivotal and important role of women in this movement. However, after looking at the questions, I just thought maybe I need to talk about more generally about its achievements, the Women Life Freedom Movement's achievements, and what basically it has done to this point, and how we see our roles and what we are looking forward to tonight. The Women Life Freedom Movement is the outcome of decades-long dissatisfaction in Iran. While it is still progressing, it has set many examples of bravery, uniqueness, and defiance. The central and fundamental role of the youth and women has enabled the world to recognize it for what it truly is, a progressive movement full of hope. Despite facing horrifying violence and paralyzing crackdowns, the movement has remained resilient since the wall of fear is cracked in a visible and a clear way, both to people and to the regime. The movement's reputation and achievements to date have won many allies and sympathizers worldwide for us. It has united a large and well-equipped diaspora tirelessly advocating for the cause, reminding and demanding every democratic country to support the movement in every possible way. In less than 1.5 years, more civil and human rights groups and collaborative efforts have been formed to assist Iranians in their fight for freedom than in the past 4 decades. A notorious regime, once confident in its bulletproof grip on the nation, is now fearful of every action the nation takes or even might take. It enters full emergency mode on critical dates, such as the death anniversary of Mahsa Amini. The whole country goes into an emergency mode just out of fear. It arrests and re-arrests activists who challenge every bit of its existence, despite of the regime's brutality, just trying to get its head around the bravery and the creative ways of civil resistance. Introduces further discriminatory law on women against women, while finding itself completely unable to enforce them due to the nation's, particularly women's, determination and willpower. So, to be honest, the reality is that something the regime knew as business as usual is a long-lost dream for them. And the movement is totally winning over them. And the fear is the actual witness. But yet there's no doubt that there is still a long way to go and there is a whole lot to do. This is why we're here today. This is why every Iranian activist group around the world is constantly working to raise awareness about the regime's criminal acts and the movement's cause and the potential it has in the heart of the Middle East. To create platforms and opportunities for dialogue and conversations around what can be done and what actually should be done to support the Women Life Freedom movement and see it succeed is the reason we're here tonight. Well, these dialogues are also very important as they help shape a roadmap for our activities and advocacy. They will help us to understand what we need to demand and how we should demand them. We're well aware of the role we have to play and are determined to play it as effectively as possible. Our role is to empower the Women Life Freedom movement, assist in its further recognition worldwide, and weaken the regime by stripping away its masks and exposing its lies. And we warmly thank you for helping us standing in solidarity with us.
Thank you very much, Hannah John, and I'm glad that you amended the your topic of presentation to be a little bit more all-encompassing than what I announced. So I'm grateful. Thank you. Friends, before we move on to our esteemed guests, I've just been reminded to tell all the audience that we have a Q&A panel, literally a panel down the bottom of your screen. So feel free to punch in your questions there. They will be moderated. They'll be voted up to me, and I will ask them as and when appropriate and when the time allows. Now, enough with me. Can I ask Golriz to give us her thoughts, followed then by Claire, and after which we'll get to the Q&A session. Golriz, thank you.
For sure. Ba durud be hamvatanan. I do want to begin by saying or greeting our Iranian diaspora community, but also anyone who is in Iran. I don't know how much reach we have, but I want to hold some space for us as Iranians to sort of acknowledge that we all in one way or another are the victims of that regime, that many of us have very real trauma as a result of being either born into that regime or experiencing the Islamic Revolution. I like to think of it as an Iranian revolution that was stolen, but that whether it's through our displacement or whether it's through direct violence, everyone we know as Iranians has experienced the violence and has that victimhood in us. I've never seen a movement that's so raw. So as we come together to talk about these things, I just want to acknowledge that we all bring something very personal to this movement, and it makes it harder, but I'm so grateful for every single one of us turning up again and again, as much as it sometimes hurts, that we haven't forgotten Iran, and it just goes to show the strength of this movement, I think. But the other thing that I want to hold in the context of this panel, which is about what we do as Australians and New Zealanders and what our governments in particular can do, is that we have to remember every step of the way that this is an Iranian movement. It belongs to this incredible young generation of Iranians who are putting their lives on the line, and every parent who's raised such a courageous generation of freedom fighters, and that this generation, having never seen freedom or democracy firsthand, is so powerful. As Hannah just said, you know, the regime is really scared. So as a diaspora community and as allies of the Iranian revolution of women, life, freedom, it's our responsibility to keep making space for them to lift their voices. This can never be a foreign-led movement, because it just isn't. It's an incredibly sophisticated movement that has spaces for rainbow communities in Iran who are targeted by the regime, for religious minorities like the Baha'i community, ethnic minorities like our Baluch communities, and is led by Iranians from within Iran, because the regime does try over and over again to say, and I've seen this firsthand, that this is an uprising that's brought about by foreigners, by foreign interference. They keep saying that, and it's just not true. So it's really important, I think, for us, as we talk about how to support the movement through our foreign Khariji governments, that we keep coming back to lifting the voices of the Iranian movement, as it is an Iranian movement. So I come to it, and I love being described as, you know, just like a human rights lawyer, because that's much better than a politician. But I'm a third-term member of parliament now. We've just changed government in New Zealand, so that's one of the contexts that I'll have to speak to. But for my first 2 terms of government, as the Green Party, we were in government with Labour. And then we were in a cooperation agreement, and now we are in opposition. So all of those contexts are really important, I think, for activists in terms of how to engage with ally political parties and with governments. But what we've tried to do as much as possible is to work collegially across the House here in New Zealand with government and non-government political parties. And I come to this work as much as possible as both a member of parliament, but also a human rights lawyer who works across different human rights issues, but also as an Iranian woman. And I think more than any of those other hats that I wear, the thing that has been meaningful for us in New Zealand as a movement has been to have those conversations and to tell the stories of our experiences, our families' experiences, the activists' experiences in Iran, and educate politicians. So I've sat on the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee for 6 years now. This will be my 3rd term on that committee. So I've become now the most experienced member of that committee, strangely. As a child who lived in a war, to be on the Foreign Affairs Defence Committee, I think it becomes a little bit meaningful. But we began in the New Zealand movement with very broad-based protests, but also with a very quick, and this is a credit to Hannah and others who led the movement here, a very direct strategy of connecting with politicians and bringing the movement into the House of Representatives. So relatively early on, we started to have meetings and events inside Parliament, and then we formed the friendship group, which was, our strategy was to educate lawmakers, both in government and opposition, about what was happening in Iran. And for my part, it was very focused, because of my experience working, I guess when my CV was being described as kind of working in international context, that was for the United Nations courts. So it was very much about what are the obligations of states when mass crimes, mass violence happens. So for me, it's really important for our governments, Australia and New Zealand, to know that there are obligations that come with our commitment to international rule of law and to those human rights instruments that we constantly talk about in this part of the world, this beautiful, peaceful, peace-loving part of the world, that it does mean that when something happens, we have to step up. So for me, it was to have that friendship group was to point out very clearly to lawmakers and politicians what their obligations were, and to educate them constantly about what's happening in Iran. One of our first asks that was very delayed was for our government to actually condemn the Iranian regime over the death of Ghahraman, and also the violence that was being perpetrated against other protesters. And by the time we did that, it wasn't as meaningful as if we had been leaders, but we had that as leverage. So we could say, well, you know, you did delay this, but now you can be a leader. What are you going to do now? And so New Zealand called for Iran to be removed from the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which was a part of our leadership role. But beyond those calls in international arenas, it became very, very clear to us, and it remains very clear to me, that if we're serious about standing up to an atrocity committing nation, that we have to hold the individuals to account. So New Zealand had very quickly responded to the Russian invasion of Ukraine through a legislative sanctions regime that named individuals who were responsible for the atrocities being committed by Russia and placed sanctions on them as individuals, which meant, for example, that no one in New Zealand could do business with them, banks couldn't hold or had to freeze their accounts, they couldn't travel here, and different Western nations took those same measures in unison, which made them meaningful. So the doors were closing on the Russian regime and on their business partners, and that was the way that our government placed pressure on, you know, and all Western governments placed pressure on them. So we asked very clearly, repeatedly, every time we had these friendship group meetings, and every time I got to have meetings with the minister, for the same either individualized sanctions regime, or, and this fed very directly into the designation of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, as a terror entity, because it would have the same impact. And our law, I don't know where Australia sits, but in New Zealand law, it's very clear. It's just an entity that does one of a certain set of actions, including perpetrates violence or kills people for the purpose of intimidating a civilian population. Now, there's no way that that doesn't apply to the IRGC. It's very clear that both regionally across the Middle East and inside of Iran, the purpose of this of this entity is to intimidate through violence. I'm less committed to expelling the ambassador, because I got to have a very meaningful engagement with the ambassador here in New Zealand. So, you know, we did call for the expulsion of one ambassador. He actually left, his term was up, and they switched over. So as the Green Party, our position was, well, ambassadors should be expelled if they don't engage meaningfully with our democratic system. But if they want to stay, then they have to come and, you know, be answerable. So he did come. I don't think he knew what he was in for, but we did call, as part of the friendship groups, ask the new Iranian ambassador to New Zealand to our Foreign Affairs Committee. And, you know, every member of that committee, including our chair, had been to friendship group meetings, so they knew the context. And I was given quite a lot of leeway to question him. And I thought what would be really meaningful in doing that was to bring with me photographs of the victims, including and beginning with Mahsa Amini, and in particular for her, you know, and it was a decision for me which photo, but you know, the one of her in the hospital bed on the day just stood out more for me. So to be questioning this man as the representative of this regime who had killed her, and to hear him deny those allegations, but to have him look at her photograph at close range as he answered the questions became a news story. And to have others who are imprisoned or executed, you know, to bring their names back into the news cycle, to have this regime stooge confronted with their names and faces became quite moving. And I mean, I think what was quite interesting to me is that because the room was filled with reporters, and once the meeting with the committee session was finished, to see the impact that it had on our media, who were absolutely shocked, like very experienced reporters, just physically, you could see the shock of having to grapple with the propaganda coming out of this regime and having that confrontation. So when Hannah says, that it's working, like really it's working both inside Iran, and having the conversation about us as Iranians change, and to be able to demonstrate what's happening in Iran at very close range to Western media, Western lawmakers. It's new. It hasn't happened in my lifetime. And I've never been able to go back to Iran. There's a whole generation of us who are also Iranian who've never had that connection, but we can help in this particular way. I would say, just to close, that whilst we've had an incredible impact in New Zealand in terms of connecting with very high up officials and members of government and opposition, we've set ourselves up very well to go to transition between two different leaderships and into this new government who is led by those who've come to our friendship group meetings already. Our government still hasn't done much more than enunciate, displeasure on the world stage. We haven't got the sanctions regime. We don't have the terror designation. So we haven't been able to put direct financial pressure on the perpetrators of these crimes in the way that Western nations did with Russia. And so we do have to keep screaming about the lives of Iranians mattering, and moving our governments to do something in a very difficult political climate, given how oil-rich our nation is and how pressured those supply chains are right now. So it's all about the popular movement. I think it's all about having the protests, getting the letter writing campaigns, getting the seminars, and telling politicians that both we as Iranians, but also our Western friends and allies, anyone who cares about women's rights, about democracy, is still watching and expects Western democracies to act.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Golriz John. And some, if I may say so, critical points raised by Golriz. And during the Q&A, we'll come back to them, specifically on how we can engage our members of parliament, our politicians, people who speak on behalf of the constituents, 2 of them here from Australia and New Zealand. So I'll leave the rest of the poking and prodding for question time. Can I ask Claire now to please take the podium?
Thanks very much, Faraz, and thanks to AUSIRAN for coordinating this Zoom meeting again this evening. It's a real pleasure to be back speaking with you all. And I think it's a really appropriate time, 14 months into the Women, Life, Freedom movement, that we take stock of the hard work that has gone into the last 14 months and the outcomes that have been achieved. But of course, remember that the work is by no means done. The fight is still there to be had. And I know there are a lot of incredibly passionate people on this call, and I know that all of you will keep doing everything that you can to ensure that this issue remains front of mind for Australians and New Zealanders and those in other countries as well, if that's where you're from. Similarly to Golriz, the point I wanted to make first up is that all of the efforts over the last 14 months from my end as a parliamentarian would not have been possible without the support of the Iranian Australian diaspora community. And it is that power and that advocacy and that passion of that community that has made it so much easier for me to talk about these issues in the federal parliament and to ask questions of our government about what they are doing, but also to keep it front of mind for everybody else as well. when I first started talking about the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody back in September 2022, I don't think anyone could have predicted that we would still be here fighting this fight so far down the track. But I mean, it is absolutely a revolution that we are seeing at the moment. There is a movement happening globally, and it has been a long 14 months, I know, but we have to keep that fight happening. We have to keep it front of mind, because otherwise people do forget very easily. And I thought it was really interesting, Golriz, talking about the fact that the regime claims that this is a foreign-led revolution, that this doesn't actually have anything to do with the Iranian people. And again, my personal experience could not be any further from that. Like I said, the reason I kept talking about this issue, the reason I kept asking the foreign minister questions about what she was doing in this space was because the diaspora were clearly dissatisfied with the response from government, and I'll get to that in a moment. And they wanted us to keep asking those questions on behalf of them. And similarly to New Zealand, we have had a number of parliamentary friendship meetings with the group, the Parliamentary Friends of Iran, and I know having that engagement across the political spectrum has been really insightful from my perspective. But again, I think important in keeping the issue front of mind is that this isn't seen as a partisan issue. I've worked with Greens colleagues in the Senate to progress these issues. I've worked with other members of the crossbench. I know that there are members of the government who feel very strongly about these issues, notwithstanding the response from them at this point in time. So yes, I absolutely think there is an important role to play for us as parliamentarians, regardless of political persuasion, to keep engaging and talking about these issues and understanding where each country has got up to in terms of its response. In terms of Australia's response, similarly to New Zealand, I'm saying similarly a lot tonight, sorry, but we sort of, it was very interesting listening to Golriz's.
We're very similar countries.
We are very similar countries, and I think sadly we've taken a similar approach to dealing with the Iran issue as well. The Australian government has implemented several rounds of sanctions since the death of Mahsa Amini and targeted specific individuals within the IRI regime, the morality police, the media, government spokespeople and officials that have been involved in censoring communications, as well as those people and entities that were engaged in the provision of drones and arms to Russia in their war in Ukraine. And obviously, as a member of the opposition and the Shadow Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs, I welcome those sanctions. They are a really good start. But I think it's important that we remember that sanctions should always be part of a broad range of measures that a government takes against a bad foreign actor. It can't be a standalone response. And also those sanctions have to be appropriately targeted so they're actually having the impact that's desirable. If you implement sanctions on an official that doesn't have any connection with Australia, or even any intention of establishing a connection with Australia, it's not really, not really the best way that we can stop the bad behaviour from happening. Yes, it sends a symbolic message, but we want to actually be doing things that have a deterrent effect. I know. I'm not sure if the New Zealand parliamentarians are in the same boat, but every member of the Australian Parliament about 2 years ago now, 18 months ago now, was sanctioned by Russia because of our support for Ukraine. So I'm sort of sitting here today, sanctioned by Russia, thinking that doesn't really impact on me. I don't want to go to Russia. I don't want to invest in Russia. So really, I'm not losing any sleep about it. But we don't want our own sanctioning regime to have a similar lack of effect. So we need to be looking at the broader suite of diplomatic actions that we can be taking, or international relations actions that we can be taking against the IRI regime. And that's why, as Faraz said in his opening comments, back in February, I presented a report to the Senate that outlined a number of different actions that the federal government should be taking to hold the IRI regime to account. And I'm sure those Australian listeners to the Zoom tonight would be pretty familiar with that process. It took a long time for the government to respond to that report, which obviously I was disappointed about. The Iranian community in Australia was disappointed about. But even more so, they were disappointed that of the 12 recommendations that report made, only a couple of them were actually accepted by the government. And one of those ones that wasn't accepted by the government that we do need to keep talking about is the listing of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organisation. This has been one of the singular asks of the Iranian community in Australia for a very long time. They have been very clear-eyed in their advocacy on this. And I don't think anybody out there is doubting the fact that the IRGC engages in terrorist acts. We are just in this unfortunate position where our government is saying it's too hard for us to do that right now. There are legislative barriers to us being able to do that right now. And we've offered, as an opposition, offered bipartisan support to the government to change any legislation required to facilitate a listing of the IRGC, because we in the opposition want to see that listing happen. But unfortunately, we haven't got to that point yet. And in the last couple of weeks of the Parliament, I did put an order for production of documents into the Senate to ask the government to provide to the Senate the information that they have on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the consideration that they have given to listing that group as a terrorist organisation. Unfortunately, that information was denied to the Senate. The relevant minister made what's called a public interest immunity claim over the provision of that information and said, on the grounds of national security, it wasn't going to be provided to the Senate, which again was incredibly disappointing to me and incredibly disappointing to the Iranian diaspora in Australia. But we're going to keep asking questions about this, because it's very clear that this must happen, because it's the right thing to do, because it's what the Iranian community has been asking for, and it's what we as an opposition have been asking for as well. Obviously, there are a whole suite of other recommendations within that report that we might have a chat about later on, but listing the IRGC is number one on my wish list. So we'll certainly keep fighting the good fight on that one. But thank you once again, everybody, for your time this evening and for tuning in to listen to what we're talking about. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Thanks, Faraz.
Wonderful. Thank you, Claire. We'll come back to the pertinent, important, and I think popular question of listing the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. But can I start the round of questions with this? This is a question often asked by members of the diaspora or activists generally, and that is, what specific initiatives or actions can the diaspora or those interested in helping the people in Iran undertake to effectively support the movement on two strands? One, political action, what can they do? And two, non-political action. Can I perhaps ask, given that Claire just addressed some of the asks of the Australian government, can I ask Claire to address that question? So what specific initiatives can Aussies implement or undertake to push and support the Women Life Revolution movement?
Look, on a political level, I think engagement with parliamentarians is particularly important. And like I said, for many, many months now, I've been meeting regularly with representatives of the Iranian community in Australia, and that has that has helped me to go to my colleagues within the opposition, to go to the government and say, we need to be doing more. Have we thought about this? To keep the issue front of mind for people, because particularly the way the world is at the moment, there are a lot of different issues that are taking up people's time and energy, and I don't want to see this issue fall off the radar. And obviously, I'm not a member of the Iranian diaspora, so I don't have quite that same level of authenticity when I'm talking about these issues and arguing for these issues. But it makes my life so much easier when I can say, well, you know, I've met with so-and-so from the community and this is what they're what they're asking for, or this is what I heard from this group when I met with them locally. So keep engaging with parliamentarians, and particularly engage with those parliamentarians that are members of the government, because again, as much as I would like to think that the foreign minister sits there each night going, what should I do that Claire Chandler has suggested I do? I think it is far more likely that she would be responsive to asks from within her own political party as well. And going back to the whole idea of having these parliamentary friendship groups, I think that's why having a multi-partisan approach on these issues is really important, so that, you know, regardless of who happens to be in government at any one time, and we've seen a change of government recently in New Zealand, we can make sure that we've got a consistent level of engagement and interest across the political spectrum.
Thank you. And whilst you may not be a member of the diaspora, Claire, I think you've been adopted as one, like it or lump it, I should say. But Golriz, same question to you. So on the back of what Claire was just saying, the engagement, the multi-party engagement. So this should not be a partisan issue. That's what the Iranian diaspora has said. What is your response to the question of what can the diaspora or other activists do to support the Women Life Revolution?
Yeah, so what I was going to say, I mean, I've got a lot of answers to this question, but what I was going to say just on the IRGC, which leads to answering this question, is that the New Zealand National Security Agency's actually found that the IRGC was, I think, second in the top 3 agencies that are interfering in New Zealand last year. So this is a very, very real issue in terms of the designation. I don't know whether Australia would find the same. We don't know who's here and who has financial interests, but we do know that they are interfering with our community here at the very least. And so I think it's a beautiful question for allies to ask, you know, how can we support? Because actually the diaspora is doing this at quite great risk to themselves. You know, many of us have family back home, and the intimidation and the interference is very real for us. So if we hold a rally, please turn up. Put your bodies on the line in that way. So to my mind, there are 2 prongs to this. There's the direct political connection, and then there's the popular communication of this issue and the movement building part of this, because we do live in democracies, and the bigger the movement, the more responsive our political actors will be to it. So to tell stories in the press, to share things on social media as part of building that movement, to connect with other types of movements that have overlaps, like feminist groups, women's groups, unions, dare I say. Sorry, that was aimed at Claire, just because I know we're from the opposite side of the spectrum. But there are different movements within all of our political systems that are non-governmental, and have a history of accessing a membership and turning up and giving us resource and giving us access to their voices as well. So, you know, if you get a panel opportunity to go off and work with Amnesty International on a campus, that's a women life freedom movement moment. If you can have a stall at a university, if you can have a stall at literally anywhere that's got people coming up to you, those are all movement building moments. But also the media. So all of us as Iranians have stories to tell. And if you're an Australian Iranian person, that gives a media agency an immediate angle into what's happening in Iran that's much more likely to be reported than just a foreign affairs story with no connection to your local area, to your local context. So that's how we've been finding ways into telling stories in media, to tell stories of former refugees whose family members are protesting and are threatened, has been a way of getting the media to continue to report on what's happening in Iran. Like I say, you know, even that moment in the committee in Parliament was all about also telling the story of what's happening in Iran to a broader audience, and then sharing clips and saying, you know, write to MPs, come to Parliament, come to the next rally or whatever else. But for sure, the actions that we took through the Solidarity group were, so they were multifaceted. So we did think very sort of strategically, and the, you know, the Solidarity group thought, I should say, about, you know, do we do this thing as a round table, and who should be on that round table? So there'd be, you know, long-standing, well-respected human rights experts as well as MPs, and then something else would just be MPs from across the House, and something else would be a bigger audience with officials, advisors. So, you know, they all sit not so much behind politicians sometimes, because they're actually defining foreign policy. It is a complex area, and to invite them and to have us be, you know, humanized, because frankly, they deal with a lot of issues. But if they've come into a space, heard from Hannah, and she's a compelling witness, seen a photo exhibit, which we brought into Parliament, then eaten some Iranian nibbles and gotten a chance to sort of interact with our community, that advisor is going to pick up a report or a speech that they're going to write for their minister on this issue and connect with it really, really differently. So we've done a lot of different things with the different spaces that we have, but it depends on how comfortable each person is. You know, if you're a protest person, do that. If you're I'm going to hold an event and give others that platform to speak, then do that. But for sure, if you can have meetings with ministers, and especially, as Clara said, with government members, then that really takes a huge emotional burden off of us as Iranians to have to keep turning up and proving that our people are, you know, dying and being tortured for showing their hair. So that's, thank you ahead of time.
Thank you to you both. So I think to encapsulate all the feedback for our audience, it's a multifaceted approach to what you can do. Broaden your audience, I think, is the message. Attend rallies if that's your thing. Have roundtables. Attend and engage in formal events like these, educational events, academic events, specialist knowledge events or otherwise, and engage with your politicians. And as Claire says, especially those in government. Now, I know, Golriz, you answered the question second, but on the back of that question, the question posed is, with the new government in New Zealand, what can we expect the policies and engagement and outreach and the velvet glove approach to be when it comes to Iran?
So I don't think that the level of sympathy is suddenly going to, I definitely think that there is sympathy, I should say, to put it into a positive frame. There is sympathy across the House for this issue. Our newly elected Speaker of the House of Representatives, Jerry Brownlee, who's a, you know, long-time Conservative National Party member, attended a protest for women, life, freedom as the first ever protest he's ever turned up to on Parliament steps last year, and he very publicly acknowledges that. He's a member of the Solidarity group. He was a member of the Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee, and asked really pertinent questions of the ambassador when we brought him in because of that capacity building. So there's definitely members across the House who feel strongly about this. But in terms of the actions to take, I think that there is more of a tendency with this government to overtly follow in the steps of sort of our Five Eyes allies. That's the sort of, and the kind of English-speaking Western nations like Australia and America and Canada and New Zealand kind of taking a little bit more of a cautious back seat in terms of foreign policy, whereas what we want to do is to lead, and we constantly talk about how New Zealand, you know, punches above its weight in the international arena, and you know, we're very well respected, but we have to use that impetus. So doing something like designating the IRGC as a terrorist entity or introducing an autonomous sanctions regime that targets sanctions against perpetrators, it wouldn't just have the impact of catching out anyone who happens to be in New Zealand or have business interests in New Zealand. At the moment, the reality is we don't know. And when we did this for Russia, we found that actually a very far implicated Russian oligarch was in New Zealand with huge business interests, and we got to freeze those, and the government had literally not known that. So it would have that direct impact of potentially actively pressuring people in the IRGC or the regime in Iran who are directly responsible for these crimes, but it would also nonetheless have the impact of setting an example and forging a path for those who we see ourselves as in terms of like-mindedness in the international arena. So we would actually say, this is an atrocity akin to what Russia has done in Ukraine. And in fact, the IRGC sells weapons to Russia that are being used in Ukraine. So some of the sanctions that New Zealand has imposed, I should mention, because there are sanctions, individualized sanctions that New Zealand has imposed on Iranian regime members have come about through the Russia sanctions regime. And whilst that's good, the message that sends the regime is that we care more, we still are engaging more with what's happening in Ukraine than directly pressuring it to abide by the human rights of Iranians. So it's a little bit different, and it's not quite what we're asking for. I think we have a real leadership role, I guess, is the point, and this government may be more likely to drag its heels and be conservative in the action vibe whilst they're quite sympathetic. So if we're writing to them, if we're meeting with them, we have to be very clear about those actions and their international obligations and what New Zealanders expect in terms of our government showing leadership.
And I'm sorry I keep leaning on you, Golriz, but the specific question on the back of that is, what is your party's approach to cooperating with the government, assisting the government, or doing what it can to pressure the Islamic Republic?
To pressure the Islamic Republic? Well, the Green Party, we've had a very direct approach. So I wrote in Farsi with a lot of help from my dad, to Ayatollah Khamenei, to the Prime Minister, to the President, to the Foreign Minister, calling what they're doing crimes against humanity, outlining how that's the case, and letting them know that each of our MPs has sponsored a political prisoner, naming them and naming how their rights are being breached. So we've had that direct, and yes, many will say that there's no point because the Ayatollah doesn't care, and I use his title deliberately, but that's another news story, and that's another way of telling that regime that the world is watching, that Iranians now live in democracies, and that those of us, that generation of us who were displaced by your regime, now have power, and we're not going to look away. So it still has some impact. We've doubled in size over the past the election that just happened as the Green Party, so we'll have more prisoners that we'll be sponsoring, but I'll be absolutely working with the Foreign Minister, the Defense Minister, and the National Security Minister to meet with them and assert the rights of Iranians to have our international rights upheld. The Defense Minister and National Security Minister is the same, by the way, and we've got a woman for the first time ever, Judith Collins, who I have a good relationship with. She's certainly a girl's girl, so she will want to stand up for women's rights no matter how much we disagree on other political issues. So I think I can safely vouch for that.
Wonderful, good, and we're all glad to hear that you'll be keeping the government to account. Now, I think that question was put by one of the media outlets, Iran International, and there's another question put by Iran International, Senator Chandler. The question put is this, that do you think it's likely that we'll see cooperation between the parliaments of Australia and across the Tasman in New Zealand, and whether or not there'll be a future to cooperate between the two governments, Claire?
That is a really interesting question. I mean, I was reflecting on Golriz's comments around, you know, whether what would have to happen internationally with like-minded partners for New Zealand to act more strongly in this space. And the point that I have always made when talking about the IRGC listing in particular in Australia is that it's something that the US has already done, and they are an ally, and therefore why wouldn't we likewise be following in their footsteps? It's not like we're doing anything, you know, completely crazy that hasn't been done anywhere else. We're just, you know, taking the fight up as a matter of consistency, of, you know, including many other really good reasons why we should list the IRGC. And I mean, honestly, I think it would be great if Australia and New Zealand could work together on this particular issue. And I certainly hope that if New Zealand acted and listed the IRGC as a terrorist organisation, I think that would, you know, make it easier, hopefully, for Australia to do the same, and vice versa. So I think it's important, as I said in my initial remarks, that we build these networks internationally amongst politicians, parliamentarians, legislators, whatever you want to call us, so that we can all try and work in lockstep together. And I've certainly had conversations with parliamentarians in other jurisdictions about what their experience is, particularly in without, you know, giving away those conversations, particularly in jurisdictions where they've likewise had difficulty getting their government to come to the table to list the IRGC as a terrorist organisation. And above and beyond anything else, I found those conversations really useful, just to understand that it's similar sort of messaging coming from governments in other places around the world of, oh, you know, but it's an extension of an organ of a state, I should say, so we can't listen because of that. Or there seemed to be a bit of excitement from government in terms of listing it, but then all of a sudden that came away. Anyway, I guess what I'm trying to say is that making those networks is important, because then we can identify the patterns that we're seeing from government's hesitancy to act in these areas, and then sort of target our approach accordingly.
And I suppose on the back of that question, Claire, which was targeted specifically or focused on cooperation between Australia and New Zealand, what about building connection or connections, I should say, amongst politicians more globally? So MPs, whether in government or otherwise, say in Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, the European bloc, and specific European nations. Do you think it's a possibility? And B, if it is a possibility, what can the diaspora, people like organizers of this event, for example, or others internationally do to bring together and collate the various members of various parliaments and or congresses together? So how can we build unity and diversity?
I definitely think it's a possibility. I am a member of a group, an international group of parliamentarians called the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, which is a group of parliamentarians that you know, has certain views around the accountability of the Chinese Communist Party, and I would certainly think that there'd be a similar appetite internationally to develop a group of legislators that have similar views about Iran. But I think first and foremost, we need to identify who those legislators are, and you only need a couple in each sort of, you know, country to start getting that group together, and then having some people who are willing to be the conduit to bring all of those people together in one place, whether it's just, you know, getting their email addresses and communicating with them regularly, or running Zoom sessions like this. So It's a lot of work for sure, but I absolutely think there would be an appetite for it, and I think it would be useful.
Thank you, Claire. And I think Golriz, on the back of that slightly amended question, same question, that is a cooperative, if I can call it, between MPs, members of Congress, parliaments, senates across the world, but those of Iranian heritage. So we know we have some in Europe, elsewhere, in Canada. So a cooperative between members of parliament of Iranian descent, that may be a springboard. The question to you, I suppose, Golriz, being one of those people, a member of parliament who is also of Iranian descent, what do you see the next step as to elevate that discussion, first of all, and then to turn that discussion into something more tangible?
Yeah, so the beginnings of that have already happened. As you say, in Europe, there are, a handful of us with Iranian heritage. And not just, I don't think it needs to be limited to sort of members, whilst that's really useful, but there are people who are well placed in other ways in terms of political influence and expertise across the different democracies, and Europe seems to be ahead of us in terms of organizing. So I've been invited into a couple of the forum meetings and had those communications, and it is good for coordinating our asks for sure, supporting the different people's movements to grow and to be sustained, because that is ultimately, as I say, keeping a broad base of support is ultimately how we hold these democracies and sort of both hold their attention and push them forward to take particular action, but sort of knowing what actions we're asking for and how we're differently going about that is really, really useful. So, we're a chorus asking for the same thing, but we all come from different systems. And so, it is a really good idea, and we are doing it. People can sort of rest assured, but I'm a member of the interparliamentary group on China as well. So it's possible. With, there just is much more awareness about the concerns of the human rights situations and what's being perpetrated in China, especially as Asia Pacific nations that we are, whereas Iran is so far removed. We almost seem a little bit lagging down here, but the setup is there for us to connect, both as for me as an Iranian diaspora member and lawmaker in New Zealand, but also for the ally members of the various entities, Senate or parliaments or whatever else. So it's happening.
And I suppose on the back of that, the coordinated efforts would obviously help in engaging with international mechanisms to hold the Islamic regime and its operators to account. So on that, getting a little bit technical here, can you give us an example of at least one form of an international mechanism or international sanction approach that the diaspora can fight for, ask for, and yell about in the streets?
Well, ultimately, we want a Security Council referral to the International Criminal Court. No, I mean, yes, but no, that's not going to happen. An international independent fact-finding mechanism was one that I think broadly we felt like could be useful both in terms of the energies of experts who are making a case for further action by the different governments, whether it's the terror designation, whether it's crimes against humanity, whether it's other grave breaches of various different international laws. In New Zealand, the Crimes of Torture Act, for example, has extraterritorial application, which means that if an Iranian person with some connection to any of these arrests that are happening traveled to New Zealand, we could literally try them in a criminal court. And things like that have happened around the world. So a broad fact-finding mission would have that impact, but it would also have a place or provide a place for this massive victim community that we have to have an official account of what has happened in their families and in their lives, which is constantly undermined by the regime. You know, from saying that a movement that's so organic to Iran is actually a foreign interference move, to saying that these incredible young protesters who are being executed were actually being executed for ordinary crimes, you know, that they were criminals, that they were murderers. Having all of those records challenged is one way that the international community can also support Iranians and to set in place the steps that we need to demand action in different ways from our governments. But beyond that, I mean, there's the Human Rights Council. That's a very political and politicized entity within the UN system, but it means that at a very high level, governments do engage with it. And then there's the expert independent bodies that sort of sit under that, but come up with much better findings, like the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CERD on race discrimination, the Committee on the Rights of the Child. All of those bodies are bodies that we can engage with and submit to. And of course, the UN General Assembly, which is becoming a very activist body right now on various issues that the Security Council is at deadlocks on. So there's, if you get a calendar of where your government is submitting or where it's at with its reporting, it can be really useful to kind of go, where's Iran? Where have we got members? How can we pressure them?
Thank you, Golriz, and I promise that wasn't a test.
I'm being too technical, I know. But
no, that wasn't a test of your memory about your practice in international law days, but it's informative, and that was a question put by the audience. I think it's very important to understand the broad picture. Now, Claire, can I ask you this question to bring it back to more the domestic level? As far as you're aware, is Australia considering any action in either removing or limiting the operation of Iranian regime operatives, former members, etc.? The example given is what's recently happened in Canada over the last couple of weeks, where senior members of the former members of the Islamic Republic regime are taken to court on deportation charges. I'm calling them very loosely those because they have technical terms under the Migration Act. So basically, the Canadian government is kicking out former members of the Islamic Republic living in Canada. We know, this has become a very long question, I'm sorry, Claire, but we know that there are members, former or currently connected to the Islamic Republic living in Australia. The question, to put it again more crisply, does, as far as you're aware, the Australian government, the current government, have any plans to kick them out, hold them to account, or arrest or seize their properties? If the answer is no, you don't know, there isn't, what can we do to push the government to do so?
That is a great question. And again, this was an issue that we looked at in the Iran inquiry at the start of this year, and that we had a recommendation around making sure that there was, that we didn't have operatives in the country, and particularly when we know, because the Home Affairs Minister told us that there have been, that the regime has been surveilling individuals within, or undertaking foreign interference, I should say, to use the technical term, within Australia. So absolutely, if these people are in Australia, they shouldn't be here. And I'm of the view that the government should be very upfront and clear about it when it has identified that occurring within our community and when they have removed those people from the country. And I've asked questions through the Senate estimates process a number of times about this, and don't often get much back from the government in way of a response, which is disappointing personally, and understandably disappointing to the rest of the Iranian community in Australia, but I think the broader community as well. I don't think it is too much to expect that all Australians would think that just as much as Australian citizens shouldn't be doing these things to other Australians just the same, we wouldn't accept it if members of a foreign regime came into our country and did these things either. We'd expect an Australian to be locked up if they were doing that. At the same time, we would expect a non-Australian to be removed from the country or have their visa cancelled if they were seen to be doing that. So I think this is one of the areas where we do need to see more action and more transparency from the government in terms of what they are doing and in terms of how they are identifying bad behaviour and what they are doing once they do. Because like I say, we had a situation back in late February after the committee report had been tabled, I think, where the Home Affairs Minister went out and said, yes, we know that Iran has been monitoring people in Australia. And then I walk into Senate estimates that day and ask questions about it, and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade doesn't want to answer those questions. So it's incredibly frustrating, and I think there is a far bigger piece of work that needs to be done here by government. And again, in a situation where they're not responding to that committee's report for a number of months, when they aren't accepting the overwhelming majority of the recommendations, I question whether or not that work is happening.
Yes, and I think it's no secret that security agencies, not only in Australia, but security agencies in New Zealand, as we've heard from Golriz, and I know personally security agencies in the United Kingdom and in Canada have been very forthright with the views as to the threat of participants or members of the Islamic Republics, either current or former members. The question is, do we have the political will? And that's the million-dollar question. Now, on the question of do we have the political will to do something, and I think this is one of the most critical questions that often arises in sessions like this, and also in private sessions, is the question of the IRGC. So can I ask you, Claire, to address this, and then I'll go to Golriz. And the reason I'm asking Claire to do it first is this, that there's been a lot of talk in Australia about designating the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, SEPA, as a designated terrorist organization. Now, each country's legislation is different. The intent behind the legislation is different. But one thing is clear. If a person or a party or an organization is acting in a way that can be defined within the frameworks of terroristic activity, and I'm using simple language here without being technical, they qualify to be so designated. So the two questions are these. One, Claire, as far as you know, is the actions or have the actions of the IRGC, those known publicly, do they qualify as acts that can be described as terroristic or acts of terrorism? One. And two, if so, why is there a stalemate on the question of designation in Australia?
I can answer the first part of that question very easily, and that's yes, of course, they're a terrorist organisation. I don't think anybody would sensibly argue that they aren't, and all of the information that you would usually gather to list any terrorist organisation under the criminal code in Australia, all of that information is publicly available. And you only have to have a quick Google of the IRGC to see some of the horrible things that they do. So there should be no question that they meet that threshold. The issue that we have in Australia, according to government, according to the Attorney General's Department, is that they can't list the IRGC as a terrorist organisation because it is an organ of the state, so to speak. And I mean, whether or not that is the case is clearly legal advice that has been developed within government, and I've asked questions about how this advice has been developed. That's part of what my motions in the Senate have been about over the last couple of weeks, is figuring out how that, and indeed my questions and estimates has been figuring out how that advice came about. But parking that advice to one side, the question is, well, even if we accept that that advice is true, it would be a relatively simple legislative change within the criminal code to allow us to list the IRGC specifically as a terrorist organisation. And as I said in my initial remarks, that's something that the opposition has offered the government support for. It's not something that the government has yet acted on. So in terms of what the Iranian community in Australia can be doing, I think continue to ask the government questions about why aren't you listing the IRGC as a terrorist organisation? I'm sure you'll all receive the same response that I get every time I ask those questions. But then ask the follow-up questions. Say, well, if it's because of the legislative barrier, why why won't you accept what the opposition has offered in terms of bipartisan support to change it? Or, how can you realistically argue that it shouldn't be listed when the IRGC does this, and this?
Thank you, Claire. And Golriz, that same question to you, but I suppose a little bit more nuanced. Why the international stalemate? Why is there such international impotence when it comes to the listing, when we know, and when I say we know, this is the public knows, that the UK in January this year, so almost 12 months ago, publicly said, we are weeks away from officially designating. Canada was hot on their heels. And Australia, I think we know this because of Senator Chandler's good work, was, I don't want to say moments away, but not far from designation. At least serious consideration was given in January this year, 2023, to designation. Within weeks, everybody did a backflip. So the question is, Golriz, why do you think the impotence? What's the problem?
Oil. That's my honest opinion. That's really fascinating, though, in terms of the Australian position, because our government the previous government has had, the advisors remain the same. So it'd be really interesting to see how this pans out. But their position has been a little bit harder to pin down, but it hasn't been that, which means that it's just bizarre that these two nations would have a different position on whether the IRGC is a state apparatus, and that's the block, or whether they're the act of being primarily a terror for purpose, entity is the reason, which seems to be more what our government or the Labor-led government was saying. What is on our side in New Zealand now is that through the Solidarity Group, we had a letter that I drafted, which addressed both of these points, signed by the foreign affairs spokespersons of all the parties in Parliament. We have a mixed member parliamentary system. So, there were parties from all sides, apart from the majority Labor party who led the government. So we sent the letter signed by representatives of every other party to the Labor Party minister. Now that the government has changed, of course, some of the signatories are now government ministers. So, that is something that's on our side. That's not to say that now that they are in a position to seek that same technical advice, that they won't then rely on it to reject the action. But to my mind, it's the supply chains, and it's just, it's more prudent to leave the third biggest crude oil producing nation, to do what it's doing, rather than to provoke it by taking this to my mind, very meaningful action that would potentially, if New Zealand took it, lead to others. But yeah, again, there's that point that the US has done it and has done it, for a while, but the US has such a special and antagonistic relationship with Iran that it's almost like they couldn't make it worse. So, it is the great Satan, but it keeps trading with Iran nonetheless, and we know that the Islamic regime says these things, but continues to trade, including in arms, with the US and Israel. So I don't know what's going on there, but I know that in terms of the nations that have a bit more to do to build and maintain our relationships with Iran, like New Zealand and Australia, that it all just went quiet once the Ukraine war affected the oil supply. I don't know if I'm being too Iranian by saying that, but I think that's what it is.
Yeah, look, I think one thing that we can all be certain of is this, that we may not know what the real reason is, why there is such, I call it international impotence, the international unwavering ability to not do something with Iran when it comes to the question of the IRGC. But one thing we do know is the excuses that we are given. In Australia, we're told because they are a member of an organ of the national state of Iran. And in New Zealand, there are other arguments about whether or not the RACs are purely focused on terroristic activity. In Europe, the position is much more smooth, if I can refer to it as that. So we know the excuses, we don't know the real answers.
But I think one thing, just as you're talking, that I do want to really hold is that, because we were in government last term when all this started, I had very direct access to, the heads of these ministries and their leads on the Middle East or the Iran situation. And the advice was very firm that we can't do anything. We can't condemn, we can't move to remove them from UN bodies, we can't, whatever else. And as the public pressure built, that did change, because we live in democracies. So absolutely, if we keep sharing this message and we keep the movement loud and keep it going, we will empower those ministers to push back on the advice, to seek advice on how to do it. Because, as lawyers, we know, and it's the person seeking the advice that sets the action. And it did change. And New Zealand did take the actions that we were asking for in the start that the officials said were impossible because of diplomatic reasons. And now we've come to this place where cutting diplomatic relations is impossible, designating the IRGC as a terror entity or imposing sanctions is impossible. But we can actually change that, and that's kind of the beauty of living in a democratic context and movement building.
Yeah, and I think the point which was being made by both of you was that we are given excuses, but excuses aside, it's the people power that makes change.
Totally.
And I suppose,
and it's a big mistake that regime made, displacing millions of us, right?
Yeah, quite. It's spreading the seeds abroad, and little seeds have now been implanted all around the world. And a child like you who moved to New Zealand, and others who moved elsewhere in the world, have now become well springs of love, humanity, and support for the brethren and sisters back home in Iran. But I suppose on the IRGC issue, and just to wrap up on this, is that the answer simply is push back, get the information out, disseminate the true publicly available details and data about what the IRGC is, what do they do. And I suppose as a bit of a spoiler alert, over the next number of months, both the NAIJ and a number of other organizations that we work with internationally, we will have sessions like this with parliamentarians from the UK, Canada, European specific nations, and European bloc as a whole. We will be exploring and asking the difficult and hard questions on the question of the designation. There is a reason. Ultimately, we don't care what the reason is, because there are lots of excuses. But can I stop talking now and ask both you, Golriz, and Senator Claire Chandler, perhaps Claire, if you can do a wrap up in 3 minutes or so. I've been talking too much, and then I'll also ask Golriz to do the same, and we'll call it a session.
Oh, I think I can do it in a bit quicker than 3 minutes for us. In the interest of time, thank you so much again, AUSIRAN and the team, and for putting this Zoom session together, and for everybody, all 50 odd of you, for listening to us talk for the last 90 minutes. It's been really reassuring to me to hear from someone from the New Zealand Parliament in Golriz about the experience over there, which I think I've said a million times already is very similar to what we've gone through in Australia. And if there is one key takeaway from tonight, and I think it's something that Golriz and Faraz and I have all spoken about, it's the importance of people power in this conversation and in this movement. We need to keep these conversations going with government. We need to keep this movement alive so that we can eventually get the right outcomes. And whatever mechanisms and platforms you have available to make your voices heard, please keep doing that. I know that those of you that are doing so with significant risk attached, particularly for those of you who have family back home in Iran. And I'm so appreciative of the sacrifice that you all make. But you're incredibly brave, and please keep up the fight. It makes our jobs so much easier.
Thank you, Claire. And Golriz?
Yeah, I think those of us outside of Iran and have had decades, depending on how old we are, of being associated with that regime. And finally, we have a moment where we can be so proud and to show the world that, you know, democracy, human rights, feminism are very authentic Iranian values. And we get to lift the voices of these incredibly courageous young Iranians who, again, you know, have never, ever seen freedom, but they're showing us what it looks like. You know, they are absolutely putting their lives on the line, facing torture, facing guns, facing tanks for freedom and for equality. And it's the absolute least we can do to bring their voices into the halls of power, to the decision-making tables, keep telling those stories, telling our own stories of being far from home, being displaced away from our families, and what that looks like as New Zealanders, as Australians. I just think that the sharing of those values is gonna be the thing that shifts this finally. And if you're allies, then all the more, because we need numbers. We get tired of proving our humanity. It's exhausting and it's devastating. But the one thing that we have on our side, all of us, is that we live in democracies. So if our politicians know that New Zealanders and Australians will not look away from the women life freedom movement, will not ever get tired of saying, you know, a 16-year-old girl should be able to wear whatever she wants, that holding hands in public isn't a death sentence, then, you know, we will win.
Well, once again, thank you to you both, Claire and Golriz, friends and supporters of the girls and the boys back in Iran. We thank you all. Again, finally, a shout out to the organizers of this event, the Iranian Solidarity Group, the team, the girls and boys in New Zealand, and AUSIRAN, the team here in Australia, some of whom I call friends and know well. So I thank you all. Thank you to the audience for making this worthwhile. And once again, hopefully we'll see you next time with better news. Thank you.